Alright guys, hope you're doing super well. Today we're going to be talking about the last bit of stuff that we need for the pre-Civil War aspect before we get to the ultimate division of our country, which was the Civil War. A couple things. One, I don't have any notes for this section. When you take your assessment next week, you're going to use those PowerPoints to help you along with it and just basically use it as if you had an open textbook at that point. So there is no notes, but there are worksheets that you guys are going to do. Those worksheets are also fair game for it. So make sure you're keeping both handy because you're going to need both. And today's worksheet specifically, you're going to be doing Lincoln's first inaugural address. I'm a huge fan of Lincoln's first and second inaugural address, largely when you read both together. You'll see why once you read the second inaugural address later this week. Without further ado, let's unpause the remote and get back to events that lead to the Civil War, starting with the Dred Scott decision. 3 days after James Buchanan became the 15th president, so we're almost there. 16th president's Lincoln and then Civil War. The Supreme Court is going to make a ruling on a very famous Supreme Court case known as Dred Scott v. Sanford. This is going to be a devastating blow to anti-slavery forces in the United States. But first, a little bit of background. So Dred Scott was an enslaved person who had once been owned by a U.S. Army doctor. That U.S. Army doctor lived in the South and then was located, just like in the Army you might be put on a different base, to Illinois, which was a free state. And this doctor brought his slave with him. And then he moved back to Missouri after leaving the Army, which was then a slave state. So basically, Dred Scott was like, well, hold on a minute. I was being a slave for you in Illinois. That was a free state. I shouldn't have been a slave there at all. I should have booked it to the other direction because that was a free state. So, with the help of a team of lawyers, Dred Scott sued, saying that he should rightfully be free because where they lived in a free state, slavery was illegal. However, if you remember anything about the Supreme Court from last year and how the Supreme Court establishes precedents, neither the North or South were prepared for what precedent the court would decide on. The Supreme Court rule of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said that Dred Scott is not a free person for two reasons. The first, Scott had no right to sue in a federal court because he was an African American, and African Americans at this point in our country were not citizens of the United States. That'll change after the Civil War, but as it stood, they weren't. So he should have no right at that point to even sue at that point. So that was the first reason. But what about the second reason? And why is there a can of SpaghettiOs there? The second reason was because slaves were considered property. Property is protected in the U.S. Constitution, regardless of what state you're in. Also, the Supreme Court ruled that in this case, that the details of the Missouri Compromise that said that slavery north of Missouri can't happen were unconstitutional. And they also ruled that no state could prohibit slavery anywhere in the United States. Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs. The reaction in the South, they rejoiced. They were like, this was great. This meant that slavery was legal in every territory in the United States. Didn't matter if you were in the North or in your South. This was something they had wanted for so long. Slavery was essentially going to be guaranteed forever, as long as the Constitution protected property. The North, just like this baby's reaction, this is exactly what the North felt like. Imagine reading in your newspaper if you lived in New York, which was a free state at the time, and said, hey, by the way, slavery is now legal in New York. You'd probably spit out your coffee at that point if you were reading the newspaper. This stunned everybody in the North. Slavery now could happen even in their own backyard. Frederick Douglass, remember him last week? Guy who was risking his freedom to be an abolitionist? Yeah. He condemned the ruling. However, he held hope because he saw how outraged the North was at this decision. It was like, maybe this is the spit on the face people need in order to wake up of just how bad slavery is. And another Northerner is also going to speak out, Abraham Lincoln. He was a lawyer in Illinois, and he spoke out against the Dred Scott decision. He's like, look, I practiced law before, so it's like, if you know anything about judges, they're former attorneys. He's like, this makes no sense. The idea that African Americans could not be citizens makes no sense. He said that it was a false view of American history. You look at American history, African Americans were fighting with us during the Revolutionary War. This is going to help propel Lincoln to the front lines of the anti-slavery fight. and ultimately to the front lines of the election. So that's one thing that happened that is going to help propel us to civil war. Here's another, John Brown's raid. Remember this guy, John Brown? This guy who was literally over in some territory and murdered some people around at Pottawatomie Creek? Well, Kansas kicked him out. So he went back to New England where he was from. But he was not happy with the situation with slavery. He wanted to do something to try to end it. So John Brown had a plan. John Brown had this idea that if I go into the South, I could raise an army of slaves. I'll just basically go plantation to plantation. I'll murder the people who own the plantation. I'll go to the slaves and be like, hey, here's some muskets. Join me and let's go to the plantation next door and let's go liberate those slaves. And we'll doing it until eventually slavery will be gone. I put the word average here because John Brown was just simply an average citizen. John Brown was not special. He wasn't just some like former army general or anything like that. He was no president. And yet look how passionate he is towards the cause. So John Brown's raid. In 1859, Brown and his small band of supporters said, look, we are going to need guns if we're going to arm a bunch of slaves in the South to end slavery. He goes and attacks a town of Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and the goal was to go into the military stockhold holdings and grab all the weapons in there. Those weapons he was going to need for his revolution in the South. Now, John Brown will be successful in getting into the building, and he'll be successful in getting all the guns. However, a certain colonel by the name of Robert E. Lee, which you'll learn a lot more about very soon, is going to surround Brown's forces at Harper's Ferry before they could escape. 10 of his followers were killed, including most of his own sons. John Brown will be captured, wounded, but captured. And then he is going to be given a trial. Due process still exists, even if you do something as crazy as attack a federal armory. So first he murders a bunch of slaveholders in Kansas. Now he's trying to cause a revolution. The court will sentence him to death for treason. But during the court case, John Brown is going to give a very compelling defense for himself. Brown would basically said that the Bible had instructed him to take care of the poor and the enslaved. If it is deemed necessary, this is John Brown speaking, that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, I say, let it be done. He was willing to die for the abolitionist cause, in other words. Now, when it comes to reactions both sides, he will be hung for treason. John Brown will be dead. The South fought good riddance, but the North praised John Brown for his efforts. And think of it from the perspective of one united country. The South is like, what are you talking about? This guy literally attacked a federal armory and killed people in Kansas. Why are you cheering for him as if he was a hero? But the North was like, he is a hero because he was trying to get rid of slaves. Again, the division between the North and South is increasing and increasing. And even Frederick Douglass spoke about John Brown. Frederick Douglass would write, his zeal in the cause of my race, because Frederick Douglass was black and John Brown was white, was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bounded by time. His stretched away to the boundless shores of eternity. I could live for the slave, but he could die for them. Says a lot about John Brown's passion for this abolitionist cause. And this painting was commissioned in his honor, as if John Brown was some type of like Moses figure trying to lead the slaves to the promised land. And notice also in that picture there, you have a clear division, as if the South and the North are going to fight over because of this John Brown's thing. It's not purely because of John Brown, but you get the idea. Slavery is driving the country apart. Now, the election of 1860, we finally reached the crescendo, which is when the music is the loudest it'll ever be in an orchestra. And that's where we're at as far as this pre-Civil War thing. The final part, which finally will eventually break this Union apart. And that's the election of 1860. The Republicans will choose Abraham Lincoln as their candidate for the presidency. The Democrats will choose two candidates, one of them Stephen Douglas, who was that guy that beat Lincoln. But even he knew that Lincoln would win this election, largely because when you run two candidates, you're splitting your party's votes. So the Democrats were going to split votes between two candidates, and all the Republicans are going to vote for Lincoln. So Stephen Douglas will try. He even warns and urged Democrats like, hey, vote for one of us, either me or Breckinridge, and let's make sure we win to make sure a Republican doesn't get into office. But that doesn't happen. The Democrats being split between their votes between several candidates, Lincoln wins the election and becomes the 16th president of the United States. And at that point, that's when the relationship will break. Because the South knows exactly what Abraham Lincoln is all about, anti-slavery. So the minute that Lincoln wins the election, the South starts leaving the Union. Once it was official, South Carolina decides, you know what, we're not going to stay here. We're going to leave before he's inaugurated, before he does something like an Andrew Jackson and says that we can't leave. And that kind of leads to my point. Why didn't the government stop South Carolina? Andrew Jackson's done that before, but that was when Andrew Jackson was president and he had the power of the military behind him. At this point, James Buchanan is known as something as a lame duck president, a president who's just basically waiting for the next president to join and really doesn't have any power. So Buchanan does absolutely nothing. South Carolina leaves the Union, and this is going to give other states some ideas. And that's going to be the formation of the Confederate States of America. So with Buchanan being useless, Abraham Lincoln having no power because he's not inaugurated yet, the states in the South are going to leave one at a time and form a new country known as the Confederate States of America, and there's their flag right there. What this ultimately means is that before Abraham Lincoln even took the oath of office, most Southern states had already left, wrote a constitution, and even elected their first president and only president, Jefferson Davis, to lead the Confederacy. When Lincoln was on the steps of the Capitol building giving his speech for the inaugural address, most of the South was already gone, and the Civil War was about to start. So Abraham Lincoln becomes president on March 4th, 1861. At first, Lincoln's not going to try to bring the South back in initially. It's more of like, hey, you've chosen a destructive path. You're welcome to come back here if you want to, but you've chosen the destructive path, and we want nothing about it. But that's not going to keep us out of Civil War for long. And then the fall of Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter was a fort that belonged to the United States of America, and it was right between the borders of the Carolinas and the North. Long story short, the problem with this divorce with our country was there was a debate on who gets this fort with all this military equipment and the ships and all that different stuff. It's located in an island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort's commander was loyal to the Union, was like, I will not surrender this fort to the South, even though it was in the South's territory. So South Carolina responds to this by basically blockading the fort. Take a look at that map right there. Fort Sumter's right in Charleston Harbor. It's literally an island. How do you get the people to change their mind on an island? Starve them to death. So they start starving the fort off. People are literally there dying of starvation. They're getting sick, malnourished, all that stuff. Because at the end of the day, Fort Sumter needs to be resupplied by the mainland somehow. And at that point, that's a totally different country's territory at that point. So it's not like the North can go in there. Lincoln at first didn't want to send any troops to try to handle this, like basically force his way in there saying, move aside, I got to save my boys. Because he was afraid that it would be outright war at that point. Instead, he sent boats, like unarmed boats, full of food to the fort to basically be on a peace mission. And that gave the South ideas. You're not going to send troops or guns to take or to help this fort? Well, now that they're weakened and basically dying from starvation, let's just take the fort. Fort Sumter was now in the hands of the Confederacy, and that's your start of the Civil War. That is when we start fighting. When Fort Sumter falls, we're at war with each other. The South versus the North. Abraham Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis. The United States of America, the Union, versus the Confederate States of America. The stage is finally set. We now have two countries instead of one union, and they're fighting each other. Lincoln was right all along. A house divided upon itself cannot stand. One side is going to overtake the other. And that's what we have a civil war to talk about now. But before we do that, that's enough for today. Hope you guys are doing really well. Make sure you do that worksheet of Lincoln's first inaugural address. And if you have any questions or anything at all, guys, just let me know.